In the last video, we saw examples of both opportunistic species and equilibrial species, that is, species with an opportunistic life history, short-lived and making lots and lots and lots of offspring, and species that employ a more equilibrial strategy, that is, long-lived and producing just a few offspring that are very, very well cared for. Now, why are those called equilibrial species? I kind of failed to mention it in the previous video. If you take a look at this logistic growth curve, because equilibrial species reproduce relatively slowly, as we approach this carrying capacity, when resources start to become thin, that means that the organisms that are reproducing each generation are going to start having fewer offspring before we get to that carrying capacity. The less food you're able to get, the less likely it is that you're going to be able to reproduce. Because if you remember way back when we were talking about niches, you need to have a certain amount of resources in order to be able to survive in an ecosystem. You have to have more resources or better resources to be able to thrive, to do really, really well, and put on body mass to be able to grow and put on muscle and fat in that ecosystem. And then even more resources to be able to reproduce in that ecosystem. So as you start losing some of those resources, you lose the capacity to reproduce a little bit. It's going to slow down. And that means that the population growth curve is going to level off as we get to that carrying capacity. Opportunistic species, because they reproduce so fast, the point at which we've overshot the carrying capacity, when the resources become thin, they find out about it almost several generations too late, right? They've already overshot the carrying capacity by a lot, and they deplete the resources when the population is already 2 or 3 times past the carrying capacity, because each individual doesn't actually need that much. So they keep going and going and going and going. It could be, just a couple of years, and then population crash. So equilibrial species are called equilibrial species because they slow down their population growth in a logistic growth curve model as it approaches the carrying capacity, and then they stay hovering around that carrying capacity. They are in equilibrium with their ecosystem. That's what equilibrial means. So let's talk about regulation of population growth through density-dependent factors. The logistic population growth curve models intra-specific competition between members of the same species for some limited resource: space, food, mates, water, sunlight, these types of things. As population size increases, competition becomes more intense, the growth rate declines proportionately. Density-dependent limiting factor, what is that? Feature of an environment which moderates the speed of population growth more intensely as population density increases. What's population density? If you have 2 islands that are the same size, right? They have the same amount of acreage on them. The island which has more of a population on it, that has more members of the population on it, is more dense. The more individuals you keep adding and adding and adding and adding to it, the less space each one is going to have, so that's increasing the population density of that space. As population declines, and the space hasn't changed, you're thinning it out, so it's becoming less dense. So population density is just taking the total population size and then also saying in a defined area, in a defined space, and saying this is how many we have per square mile, per acre, something like that. So, some examples of density-dependent limiting factors. Limited mates, so you can see these 2 antelope butting heads fighting for mates. Limited territory, this is a good one. These are creosote bushes, and you can see that they're not packed in close together. They're not tightly packed. You could get more bushes in this area, but each one is spaced out. They've carved out a little territory for themselves, and the reason why is because creosote bushes actually secrete poisons into the soil around them which prevents any other creosote bushes from germinating in that soil directly around them. So once they've carved out a little area for themselves, another bush can only set up shop if it's several feet away. So you can draw little circles and map out territory here for each one of them. And this way they don't have to compete for sunlight with each other by growing directly over top of each other. Each one has carved out space for itself. And that also means they don't have to compete for water resources, because any water that falls right in this one's territory is going to go right to this one, and the nutrients that are in the soil, right? But they fight for territory instead. If you imagine, if there's a certain footprint that each one of these is claiming for itself, well, you can measure how big that is, and then measure how big the desert here is, and that's the functional limit of how many creosote bushes you could have. That would be the carrying capacity for this desert of creosote bushes, if that's the biggest limiting factor. The accumulation of toxic wastes, flower beetles. So these beetles sometimes get into flower sacs, and if you have a couple of beetles in there, they can live in the flower sac for a very long time, but you increase the number of beetles and increase the number of beetles, they're eating the flower. The food might last them for quite some time, but as they're eating the flower, they're excreting waste, and that waste is toxic, even to the beetles. So the more beetles you have in there, the more waste starts building up, and the environment becomes poisonous for them. So before they ever run out of food, they will end up poisoning themselves and polluting themselves out of their environment. So the accumulation of wastes might actually be a stronger density-dependent limiting factor than the loss of food in that situation. Or a limited food or water supply. Here you can see several different species. We have wildebeests and we have zebras, and we also have the plant life up front. And you probably know that there are fish and probably crocodiles down in the water here. All of them using this exact same water source. So this is interspecific competition and intraspecific competition for this one limited resource. For one reason or another, there's going to be some limiting resource that is the absolute cap about determining how many of a given organism you can have in this area. So in this example, you might say water is the limiting factor. Yeah, there's water, but if you added another zebra, the amount of competition that would be required to get them enough water to be able to survive with all of the wildebeests and all of the other zebra there and all the other plants and animals and all of this, it would require so much effort that the population just couldn't sustain another zebra. The ecosystem just couldn't sustain another one. And if you add one more zebra, another one is going to die as a result, and we'll get right back to the carrying capacity. On the next slide, this is another kind of curve, but this is not a population growth curve. This shows a different kind of effect that's related. So on the x-axis, we have the number of breeding pairs of birds in a location. Number of breeding pairs means we found nests of this kind of bird. This is a great tit. And way over here on the left, there's 0 or 10 breeding pairs of birds, 0 to 10 nests. And then way over here on the right, you have 90 nests counted. Up here, we have clutch size. Clutch size is the number of eggs per nest. And then notice something. In locations where we found very few nests, right, 10, 20 nests, we had really large clutch sizes, 11, 12 eggs per nest. In areas where we found lots of nests, we found very few eggs in each nest, 7, 8 eggs per nest. And then in between, you have this downward curve, right? And you can see the trend. The fewer nests there are, the more eggs per nest. The more nests there are, the fewer eggs per nest. Why would this be? Because the more nests there are, the higher the population density, right? The more birds in that ecosystem. So the greater the competition is for resources. And if competition for resources is high, that means each breeding pair is not getting a lot of resources for themselves, so they can't have as many eggs. So they will have fewer eggs in that nest. However, in locations or in years where there is a much smaller population of birds and they don't have a lot of competition with each other. When there's only 10 to 20 or 30 breeding pairs, 10 to 20 or 30 nests, there's very little competition for resources. So each nest can have 10, 11, 12 eggs inside of it. So that's what this effect is showing you, is that the amount of competition directly impacts the rate of reproduction. And since competition and reproduction are both concepts that inform how a species changes and evolves generation to generation, this is just one of the things that I love about teaching this course. I teach evolution in other biology classes, but without understanding ecological niches and population ecology and these kind of things, you really can't understand the game theory, the nuances of how the whole process works. And you guys are getting to see at least a little bit of that. When I say that organisms born with traits that make them better competitors are going to result in them having more offspring than their brothers and sisters and other organisms in their population, this is the kind of thing I mean. There's a very literal connection between those two effects. So on the next slide, we have once again the exponential growth curve, which remember is a J-shaped growth curve, and any species will experience if they're given unlimited resources in their environment. But you will also see opportunistic species undergo this growth curve even when they're not given unlimited resources, because they tend to reproduce in boom and bust cycles. But once they overshoot their carrying capacity, they will have a population crash afterward. On the other hand, down here we have an equilibrial species which has an S-shaped logistic growth curve, where once the population gets up to their carrying capacity, the population growth slows down and slows down and slows down, and then it stays at a flat rate. And this flat rate is when the number of new individuals born every year is equal to the number of individuals dying every year. So the population growth rate is therefore 0. So if opportunistic species don't respond to density-dependent limiting factors, are they just constantly in a boom and bust cycle? And the answer is no, actually. There are other factors that can influence their population growth and keep their population down without requiring them to grow to a point where they have a population collapse. And these are called density-independent factors. They are population-limiting factors whose intensity is entirely unrelated to the population density. So natural disasters are really good density-independent limiting factors. The main difference between a density-independent factor and a density-dependent limiting factor is that a density-dependent factor is something that organisms are typically competing over or gets stronger as the number of individuals increases in that population. So the amount of water available is a density-dependent limiting factor, because the more individuals you have, the less water each individual gets. However, a forest fire coming through is a density-independent limiting factor, because it does not matter how many individuals there are in that ecosystem at the point where the fire comes through. It's still going to clear out a large portion of your population. It doesn't matter if you have 10 individuals or 100,000 individuals. It's still going to wipe out a large percentage of your population. There's no competition involved in density-independent factors. Floods, another example of a natural disaster that would just come through and reduce your population size. Storm events are another example of such a thing. And there's another kind of effect as well, where you can have two populations that hold each other's numbers in check. So here we have an Arctic lynx and a snowshoe hare. And for the purpose of this example, we're just going to assume that the only food that the Arctic lynx eats is the snowshoe hare, and the only predator for the snowshoe hare is the Arctic lynx. On the next slide, you can see their population growth and drop-offs mapped out over time, over the course of about a century, as a matter of fact. And in red, you have the lynx population, which is at most points lower than the hare population. And you have the hare population in blue. Now take a look at the nuance here. You can see that they both go up and down and up and down and up and down. But look at the detail. We start off with the Arctic lynx population really high, relatively high, and the snowshoe hare population relatively low. That means you have a lot of predators and no food for them. So what happens? You have a population crash of these predators and down they go. But now we have a situation where there's almost no predators around. Remember Australia. So these hares are in an environment where there's very few predators. Their population skyrockets. Look at this, giant skyrocket. But now the Arctic lynx are in a situation where they have very little competition from other members of their own species, and there are ample food resources. There's tons of snowshoe hare around. So they gorge themselves on prey, and their population goes up. And then you can see that that causes a dip in the hare population, and it crashes here. And once it crashes, there's not enough food to sustain this population of lynx, so then we get a crash in the population of lynx. You can see that the lynx population starts declining after this initial dip here, and then it really completes its decline right after the giant drop-off in the hare. But then there's very few predators, so what happens? The hare population skyrockets again, and it skyrockets even more than it did last time, and following that, the lynx population skyrockets even higher than it did last time. But now there's plenty of predators, so the hare population drops off. In fact, it starts dropping off before the lynx population fully catches up. Why is that? Overshot their carrying capacity. So they are having a population crash, and they take the lynx population with them, because as that food resource starts to disappear, all of the lynx start starving. So now we have both populations way down in the gutter. Which one is going to recover first? The more opportunistic species. So the ones with shorter lifespans that reach sexual maturity a lot quicker, that's the hare. Their population recovers really fast. Shortly thereafter, the lynx pops up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down all the way to the end. I'm not going to do this all the way for hundreds of years, for 100 years or rather, but you can see that the population cycle of one species is keeping the other species in check. And in general, this prevents either of them from shooting way past their carrying capacity. Sometimes it still happens, but shooting way past their carrying capacity, which then causes a massive crash. So this is a way that opportunistic species can be kept relatively stable. It goes up and down, but relatively stable in their population size over time. Now, to close out this discussion of population boom and bust cycles and opportunistic species and this kind of thing, we're going to talk about lemmings. This is another thing that's specifically named in the learning objectives that we should talk about. And I'm going to debunk a certain misconception that a lot of people have about lemmings. So, this is a lemming, by the way, this picture on the right-hand side. They kind of look like a guinea pig. And when their population starts going up and up and up and up, and the population density becomes too high, there's too many individuals per square mile, or per acre, or something like that. What lemmings do is they migrate and they disperse. They move to new areas. They will move around in order to try to find new locations to populate. They may get hunted during that migration process, which will also thin out their numbers, but they'll try to spread out in order to find new frontiers. When a population of migratory lemmings comes up against a body of water, they can swim. They're pretty good swimmers, so if they come up to like a pond or a lake, they can get in there and they will just swim right across. It looks like a little carpet moving across that lake, and they'll go to a new location. They also, speaking of organisms that live in boom and bust cycles, they are some of the fastest reproducing rodents on the planet. Their population can explode to many times its size, something like 10 times its size, or a ridiculous number like that, in a single year. So they have massive population booms, and you can imagine that the predators in that area are very happy about that. So they get lots and lots of food, and they decimate that population real fast. So because of these factors, lemming populations explode. You have lemmings all over the place, and then they disappear very rapidly. When Walt Disney Studios was making a wildlife documentary, and here's the advertisement for that wildlife documentary. It was called White Wilderness. In Technicolor, they talked to an ecologist. They did research, and apparently this ecologist, I don't know if this was an actual idea that he was kicking around or if he was just making a joke. He said something akin to, maybe they just tossed themselves off a cliff. And they heard that and they went with it. And in this documentary, they said that lemmings, when they get into a herd, they'll start moving together, and they'll move so fast, and they get caught up in the herd mentality, so much so that none of them is really the leader, and they'll all just run off of a cliff. And the problem with that was it's a wildlife documentary, so you don't have any footage of that, because that's actually not something lemmings do at all. So what they did was they built in a studio like a turntable to film lemmings running on this turntable, and then they constructed a little like cliffside on a table side, and then just put the camera below it, and then they sort of like tossed lemmings off the side of the table and got footage of them, what looked like lemmings throwing themselves off a cliff, in order to propagate what they honestly thought was a true fact, because they heard it from someone that they interviewed, but is not at all a true thing that lemmings do. And then this, it was a Walt Disney film, so lots of people saw this, and it became ingrained in pop culture as a metaphor for people who just go with the herd and do whatever the group is doing, right? You're such a lemming, right? If everyone jumped off a bridge, you jump off it too. That's what we think of lemmings. But I'm here to debunk this myth. That's not something lemmings do. They do not commit mass suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs. They just migrate to other areas when the population density becomes too high, because they want to be able to eat. And as long as we're talking about it, I figured I'd include some of this footage from White Wilderness here in the video, and you can see the lemmings ending up in the water below. This film won an Academy Award. Next video, we're going to talk about ecological succession. So I'll see you then.